both anticipate an injury.
Recording in progress.
Hi, this is the Old Farts. We're trying something a little bit different, and we're welcoming a previous member of Old Farts back, Steve Austin. Hi, Steve.
Hello.
Today's um, today's topic, or at least the jumping off point for today's topic, is what do you do when rights and freedoms collide? When my right to do something or not to have something done to me is in conflict with someone else's right to do something or not have something done to them. And using as a jumping off point, the Supreme Court at the end of its term had two fairly interesting cases. The first one was a woman who was thinking about having a cake decorating business, which is a public business. It was not a private thing, but a public business, said, if I start my business and someone who is homosexual comes and asks me to do a cake for their wedding, I don't believe that this is that homosexuals should marry. Therefore, I would be going against my profound beliefs if I were forced to do a cake. The second, and obviously the other side of the coin is that the public should be served by any business that offers itself as a public business. So the law says one thing, but our society is very sympathetic to those who have very sincere beliefs to try to honor them or avoid violating them. The second one is a little bit different. For many years, many colleges and universities, when they were trying to determine who they were going to admit as students, would give some minor preference to people of color, specifically African Americans, because they felt that the African American experience over the last 100+ years has been so profoundly difficult that in order to allow these people to more fully participate in our society, that they should be given a little bit of preference so that they even out the playing field. And the Supreme Court said in that particular case that the law is very clear. You cannot discriminate and by implication give preference to someone based on their race. Here we have rights to conflict. And the question, really two questions. One question I think I have an answer for, and that is when you have these rights of conflict, you need to have some way to resolve them. And in our society in general, you go to the court supposedly being a neutral body who looks at things primarily based on the law, but also in terms of suggestion that somebody made a moment ago, in terms of who's injured and how can you fix the injury. The other way is for the courts to say there are some rights that are more important than other rights. And I've gotten to the point where I don't really understand too much more. So I'm wondering if the panel would have some comment.
Well, one option is the court decides not to decide. So, and I think that's an important distinction. The court may decide that it's not within its jurisdiction and will leave it to, say, Congress to make up an appropriate law governing that particular situation. So let's always keep in mind that the Supreme Court does not have to march in. It can throw the case aside. Kick the can down the road is another way of expressing that, maybe. A second way of looking at this is not one side disputing another, but a balance between the rights of the individual and the needs of society in general. And I don't remember very much about college, but remember studying Rousseau and John Locke. Back in the 18th, 17th century, these were big contentions about the rights of the individual versus the needs of society, and what must be sacrificed by individuals in order to have a better society in general. So that's another way of looking at it. It doesn't answer your question, Robert, but it sort of gives it another viewing angle. And I guess if you're going to look at what makes for a better society, you then get into an activist Supreme Court. Like, for example, the Supreme Court back in the 60s and 70s, it was very activist in deciding what the needs of society were, and that was certainly to promote the interests of Blacks in America. Many people don't think that should be the role of the Supreme Court, that the role of the Supreme Court should be interpreting the Constitution. But the Supreme Court does have the option of taking a wider view. But these are just different ways of looking at it.
Well, let me throw out another thing. The original purpose of the Supreme Court was to be the highest court in the land in terms of adjudicating issues. So if you have Steve and I get into an argument and we go to court to get it resolved, and the court we go to decides A, and one of the two of us doesn't like that decision, we have the right to go to a supervisory court, which says basically, did the original court consider things properly? Did it consider all the facts? Did it give them fair weight? Did it interpret the law properly? And we can keep going and going until such time as we get to the Supreme Court. The whole purpose of the name is the top court, last one. And they decide basically whether the original court made an appropriate decision. It wasn't until Marshall, 20 or some odd years after the founding of the federal government, that he said, well, no, it's more than that. We're the only ones who can say whether, in fact, a law is constitutional or not. That was never, to my understanding, part of the original plan for the Supreme Court. And yeah, you're right. They also take on issues that are of concern to society, which theoretically, at least, there isn't. The issue would not have come to the Supreme Court. One obvious example is back in the 70s, I believe. Rhode Island had a law which forbade contraceptives being sold to anybody but married couples. And the Supreme Court basically said no. Now, the law was clear, but they made a, if you will, activist decision that society would benefit from allowing that to happen, allowing contraceptives to be given to unmarried couples. And by the way, that law was the basis ultimately of Roe versus Wade. And when Justice Thomas wrote his opinion and said, we should go back and look at some of these other laws, that was the basis. There wasn't anything in the Constitution specifically that said people should be free to do what they want as much as possible within the privacy of their own home. Today, it's a different opinion.
Well, the question of building the Constitution is probably still a sticky wicket. Certainly, life today was not able to be envisioned by the founding fathers. The whole idea of contraception, the whole idea of abortion, the whole idea of AK-47s, the whole idea of nuclear weapons. It sort of, I mean, the notion of trying to look into the skulls of the founding fathers to find out what they would have thought about weapons of mass destruction is probably a futile job, but it's still an attempt on the basis of the Supreme Court to do that. So I think that sort of brings up another issue. How fundamentalist can you get as far as the Supreme Court is concerned?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that whole discussion that given modern government, you talked about Rousseau and all those philosophers. I mean, given the modern concept of democracy and values which we want the society to uphold and society to grow, actually evolve, that needs laws, not only laws, also approach by the government to make sure that everybody goes up about in the same way, in the same direction, in a way that benefits the society, rather than just enact the laws in isolation. And I find that kind of thing, although my rights and Steve's rights may be sometimes may not be similar, but at the same time we have some responsibility, both of us, towards the society to make sure other people also are uplifted at the same time, while we fight amongst ourselves about my right and his right. And what about the rights of all the other people whose rights don't get addressed? And one of the questions that you brought up earlier is affirmative action. And the whole idea that you need certain provisions to uplift this certain group of society in the society was designed as a sociological experiment, rather than something which is enshrined in the Constitution. Because the folks who wrote the Constitution, they had slaves. They thought of 3/4 of a person, and rather than whole person. I mean, how can we then go, as Steve pointed out, how can we go into the skull of the founding fathers and extract information in current context, which asks for fundamental changes in the thinking which was going on at that time? So that's where I stand in this. So it is complicated, but I think we have to keep the upliftment of all the individuals in our in our mind when we ask for these kind of judgments, or
Well, one thing,
ask the court to intervene. And I like the idea that the court does not have all the way to march in. They can say, well, we will not.
one thing I find very interesting, you know, we talk about the rights of individuals as being a fundamental building block of the Constitution. But even that notion has been changed recently, because now we have allowed corporations to be surrogate individuals, according to Supreme Court edicts. So how do we put that into a context? Do individuals, i.e., in the shape and form of corporations, have the same rights as individuals? Or to what extent do they have the same rights? I think the court does believe that that there's no difference. Is that correct, Robert?
My understanding, and unfortunately John's not here to give a better explanation, my understanding is that we're talking about the freedom of speech. In other words, a corporation can speak as an individual. I don't think they have the Fifth Amendment right. I don't know that. It'd be interesting to look up. But I have a problem with it, because when we talk about rights, we always kind of ignore responsibilities. I have the right to yell and scream, but someone else has the right not to listen to me. And I have to respect that. It's a responsibility I have. So if I want to yell and scream, I need to do it in such a way that I'm not disturbing my neighbor. And I'm not clear that corporations are necessarily held to that same standard. Maybe they are, I don't know. I always use an example. A number of years ago, my wife and I were coming back from New York, and we stopped at Yale because my wife loves to tour college campuses. We'd never been to Yale. So we pull in and we park, and we come into the middle of a major demonstration because a Chinese prime minister or something was visiting Yale at that time, and the Uyghurs were on everybody's mind. Uyghurs being the Islamic sect in Western China. And so there was a massive demonstration going on in front of the campus, which was fine, except for one minor detail. They had set up loudspeakers in such a way that there was, when they spoke, the reverberation, the sound, made it impossible, A, for anybody else to speak, and B, for you to really even think. It was just total domination. And I was caught in a bind. I'm a great believer in free speech. I'm a great believer that you could speak, and in such a way that other people can hear you, because speaking in your shower doesn't really affect much change. But you speak so that somebody can hear you. But the other person has the right not to be forced to listen. And how do you deal with that? If there were a court case that came out of it, and believe me, by the time we left, I wanted to go to court and shut these people up. Not that I disagreed with what they were trying to accomplish, but the way they were doing it. How would the court come down? On what basis would they make a decision? And if they made no decision, isn't that a decision in and of itself? If they say, yeah, the Uyghurs can or the people supporting the Uyghurs can continue to keep everybody else from doing anything. That's a decision saying free speech overrides the ability not to listen.
Mm. Well, personally, although greatly in favor of affirmative action, thought that there was some logic involved with the Supreme Court decision not to forbid universities to consider race as part of the selection criterion for new students. I do see that. I'm not sure I entirely agree, but it's got some small amount of sympathy with me. And from a practical standpoint, I think I could envision many other ways of accomplishing, just atoning for centuries of neglect of Black people by ways other than strictly mentioning speech, like, for example, making a selection criteria on income or possibly geographic areas. Or as apparently it is happening, just eliminating a very bogus selection criteria like children of alumni. I was just reading about one college that has now completely eliminated that selection criterion on the basis of the Supreme Court decision. So they're no longer going to have anything to do with children of alumni getting preferences. I think that's wonderful. So it may very well be that that Supreme Court decision in practice may lead us to more fruitful ways of doing affirmative action. I don't know.
By the way, let me clarify something that I think gets lost in the conversation on this affirmative action thing. It wasn't a deal where I mark down I'm African American and automatically I'm in, or I mark down African American and all the people ahead of me get downgraded a little bit. So even though they are demonstrably better, I get in anyway. It was just if you take a point system and the point grades being give you a certain amount of points and your alumni gives you some points and your race gives you some points. It was really a way of breaking ties more than anything else. And I think that when it's seen that way, it becomes, I think, a little bit easier to accept. By the way, I totally agree with you, Steve, that race positive or negative, religion positive or negative, sex positive or negative should not be the overriding factor. But when you have to make choices, when you've got 10 openings and you got 500 individuals, you got to figure out some way when people appear to be equal to winnow out some so you can get to that 10. And if one of the 10 decides not to come, that you know who the next person in line is. You don't have to go through the whole process all again.
I mean, that's exactly what I know that most of the time, the admissions process does not really just get all the Black people in without considering all the other parameters and comparing the applicant pool. And the unfortunate thing about this decision is that the decision is based on a stooge group, which is Asian Americans, and they could not get the folks who are really complaining, so that the Asian American group stood in for the white folks to complain, which is kind of interesting strategy that guy who has been litigating for the last 20 years. He found this group, and it worked for him. He must be on a roll to go on to another case. But I still agree with you that yes, as a society, we have an obligation to fix the wrongs that have been perpetuated and perpetrated on a certain group of people, not unbeknownst to them, but unfairly. And because of that, over the centuries, when you go over the years, when you go generation after generation being subjected to that kind of behavior, that kind of a societal pressure, that leads to consequences that are not trivial. I mean, you have redlining of the areas. You have how they can get credit and how they can get educated, and all these things happen, which has had tremendous impact on how the so-called backward classes can thrive and grow. If you don't give them the opportunity, they can't grow. And although we can say separate but equal, what are we talking about? And that was also one of the Supreme Court decisions, separate but equal. But then what happened? That didn't work, at least from the standpoint of some certain groups. Other groups cheered on.
But again, I hate extremes, as you well know. Separate but equal was determined, I think it was in the early 50s, as being impossible. You can't be separate and equal.
Right.
And so a number of things were forced to change. And the situation of the African Americans specifically throughout the country is better than it was.
Yes.
It's far from equal. It's far from ideal, but there is improvement. And to go back to the idea that, well, yeah, we've solved all the problems. So therefore, if you don't want to, if you're right not to associate with this other group is more important than that group's right to be part of the society, a full part of the society, then we go backwards in time. And I don't think that the society benefits. Let me throw out an idea of a principle that I would ask for that both Congress and the Supreme Court consider, and that is their decisions need to be the greatest good for the greatest number. Nothing that anybody does will be great for every individual, and nothing that anybody ever does will be horrible for every individual. What you're trying to do is a balance. So you take a step to do something and the group benefits. And then you should take a step in somewhat of a different direction to help those who got screwed by the previous thing. The ultimate hopeful result is a fairly, not totally, even playing field for everybody. And then you allow, given an even playing field, everybody to compete, and there will be winners and there will be losers. But you should not set things up so that a particular group is an automatic loser. I don't know if I've said this properly or not.
I mean, that's what Steve pointed out, that maybe the affirmative action could be based on the income rather than just the color of the skin. And so if you can, or the background where they come from. And so those are different ways to right the wrong without actually hurting larger numbers in rather than creating a new group with wrong. So that might be a better idea that way.
Yeah, or I think it was Roberts that created a roadmap for an alternative approach, and that is to have candidates for colleges be chosen on the basis of their life experiences, which could include growing up Black or growing up Jewish or whatever, and then putting that into the form of an essay rather than checking a box that says, I am Black. That's a perfectly decent roadmap. But by the way, one of the good benefits of this Supreme Court decision and the drop off in the number of Black candidates at Ivy League schools, it's been a bonanza, I understand, for the traditionally Black colleges who were previously underfunded and underutilized. And now they're getting a huge number of candidates and probably improving their scholarship considerably. So it's awfully hard to predict what's going to happen when you make a move and drop something into the pond. This is one of the favorable ripples.
And I agree. And as I said, nothing is all good, and nothing's all bad. My wife will come charging down the hall in a moment to beat me over the head for saying that. But traditional Black colleges are benefiting because they're getting much better candidates coming in, which of course means that some of the people who were originally able to go can't go anymore. And two, suddenly now, if you go to a Black college, someone can say, well, yeah, you did really well, but it was a Black college. It wasn't at Harvard or Yale or Cornell or Duke or whatever. It wasn't one of the good schools.
Yeah.
No,
It wasn't the Wharton school that Trump went to.
right. But I also, you lose out, which is one of the original goals of this affirmative action. You lose out with the idea that people get to experience people other than the same people that they went to grade school and high school with. One of the supposedly the good things about college is you get to meet people that otherwise you would never come in contact with. And what is the rule if I want somebody from California just because they have a different view of the world? I can't give them preference because it means that somebody from South Carolina might not be able to go. There isn't any ideal. And I was thinking when you were saying about writing an essay, I think that was, by the way, the first solution that I heard from one of the pundits. Let's say I'm a really good father, and my kid is smart enough to go to school, but there's no way I'm going to be able to come up with the money for him to go to Harvard. You know what I might do? I might say, son, I love you. I'm going to make the almost ultimate sacrifice. I'm going to leave this house so that you will have a story to tell on your essay in 2 years. Tell me it can't happen.
Well, I won't comment on that one.
Well,
this sort of brings up a somewhat different topic, and that is that, of course, what motivates colleges is not necessarily favoritism for whites or favoritism for Blacks. I think what motivates, particularly the Ivy League schools, but probably all colleges, is favoritism for money.
Yes.
And which, of course, definitely explains why children of major donors, and children of alumni, and children of wealthy people who can participate in white sports like fencing and field hockey and other
Ice
things
hockey.
ice hockey is not exactly a wealthy man's sport, but I think field hockey for women is and there are a whole bunch of other sports that are well funded with colleges. So that brings up the whole subject about the whole basis of our educational system is so much based on profit motive. Maybe we need to rethink that. But this is a totally different topic. But the motivation of colleges to me is important.
Well, I'll give you a real life example. In the early 90s, I got laid off from my job, and my daughter was going to Syracuse, and I had been paying tuition, and suddenly I didn't have any money coming in. And I went to Syracuse and I went to the scholarship office and I said, this kid's good. She's doing well in your school. She's likely to have a good career. I can't send her. At minimum, you got to give her loans so that she can continue to go to school, but you should give her a scholarship. Why? Because if she has a career that it's beginning to look like she will have based on her academic records, don't you want her to think of you as a good place to put some of her extra money? They didn't give her any scholarship, but they did give some loans. And I don't know if she ever gave them any money, perfectly honest. But that's part of it. If I had gotten into Princeton, I applied to Princeton. If I had gotten, let's say, into Harvard back when Jews were not popular on campus at Harvard, and I had done well, and I had gone ahead and made a lot of money, I think I would have been more interested in giving some money to Harvard than I would have been to give to some local school, because they helped me. So, the money is a good motivator, but I don't think that's the only motivator of Harvard. I think it's a major motivator. They didn't get billions of dollars in endowment just because somebody didn't know what to do with a couple extra bucks. They go out and they work for it. But find somebody who's going to make a contribution and make sure that they grew up with the idea that in a good world, you pay back. And I think that solves the problem that you bring up. In terms of rights, getting back to, what do you do with the original case where somebody was afraid that if they went into a given business and were asked to do something that was legal, but as a matter of fact was promoted by the law, went against their profound beliefs? How does society deal with that? What is more important, my profound belief or your ability to participate in society?
This was a strictly hypothetical case, wasn't it?
Yeah, but
then why did the court ever decide it? Why did the court take that case?
Because they wanted to.
That is what constitutes an activist court, isn't it?
Yes. Oh, they may claim not to be an activist court, but they are. In the same way as courts going back to the beginning.
That the Warren Court was enacted.
Well, the Warren Court was the one who came up with Roe versus Wade, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was certainly activists. They invented a right that hadn't existed before, and then
Right to privacy. Right.
Yeah, and having invented that right, they went ahead and decided a whole bunch of things, which there was no legal basis for otherwise. It was one of those things where government was not supposed to be involved in these issues. Certainly not the federal government.
At least Roe v. Wade was a real case.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was decided after the baby was born.
But
It would have been, in any real court, it would have been moot. There was no longer any, the harm had already happened. There was nothing to be gained by deciding the case. They chose to.
But this web designer case was strictly hypothetical.
Yeah.
Wasn't the EPA also set up during that time? And I think the court had weighed in as well. This was Nixon time.
I can't speak to that. I don't know.
Okay. But again, going back to the fundamental right of my right not to sell a cake to somebody, I have that right. But at the same time, I would still argue that given that I have set up a shop as a public place, so I'm in that sense I have an obligation to the society, and that, I think, in my mind, trumps, for a better, lack of a better word, that trumps the my own feeling about not contributing to the same ideology or behavior.
You brought up Trump, not deliberately, I don't think, but I'll go back a ways. I think it was in the 80s. It may have been a little before that and a little bit afterwards. Both Fred Trump, his father, and Donald Trump were convicted of discriminating in public housing.
Mm-hmm.
They would not rent to African Americans. It may well have been profoundly held beliefs. I'm not in a position to say. But the society said that you cannot discriminate. Even though there is a cost to you, you cannot discriminate. Steve, the laws of the United States say that public accommodations need to be handicapped accessible. Costs a lot of money. I think that society benefits from everybody having access to whatever the capability they have. But if I were a business owner trying to set up the business or try to accommodate things so that people who, I don't care whether they come to whether they buy my product or not, do I have a case from the Supreme Court? And more importantly, should I have a case?
I mean, they're infringing upon your rights as a business owner not to put in handicapped access.
Right.
You don't want to do that?
Because it's going to cost me a lot of money. I may not be able to start my business or continue my business because of the costs that are not fundamental to the business itself. I have an ice cream stand. Not an ice cream stand, an ice cream shop. And I took over something from somebody, and the doors aren't wide enough to deal with the wheelchairs.
Happens to me all the time.
Yes. The law says I have to make those doors wider. I'm saying I can't afford it. There's a real damage to me. It prevents me from going into business or staying in business or whatever. What should the court say? I have my own opinion, which is everyone has a right to participate in society. But so I have a hierarchy of rights. Right A trumps right C. Both are real rights, and in different situations, they might prevail. But when they are, specifically are in conflict, in my world, I have a hierarchy.
I mean, it's a similar situation actually, which is the wheelchair thing. You go to an airline, so you buy an airline ticket, and you ask for a wheelchair for an elderly person. They could say, "Well, we can't afford all that." So what does that mean? That means the elderly person cannot go from place A to place B. They are deprived of. They are injured basically. They have injury because they couldn't go. So, but again, infringing on that right versus the airline saying we can't afford it, that has to jive somewhere.
At some point, somebody's got to make a decision. And we, in our society, we would rather not make that decision at the barrel of a gun. I'll give you, talking about the airline and the handicap. I was just reading an article a day or two ago where a bunch of airline passengers are suing the airline because they claim that people are asking for wheelchairs so that they can board earlier.
Wow. Ooh, good idea.
Yeah.
I'll think about that.
It was an interesting article. And they feel they are being harmed, particularly if on something like Southwest, where there are no assigned seats. If you get to board earlier, not only do you get to put your bags where you want it, as opposed to God knows where if you're late, but you get the better seat. Major advantage.
That is where, again, I have the same problem in understanding that not understanding. I understand what they are doing, but I'm just wondering again, don't the individuals in the society consider being considerate, being conscientious of the difficulties the other folks face, rather than only me, my rights? That's what that baffles me.
Well, I think we're becoming a me first society.
Were we ever any different? Ultimately,
I don't know.
Actually, we have to have been, because they did pass things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and things like that. So at some point, the society said, what's happened up till now is wrong, and we've got to do something about it. So I take back my statement about were we ever any different?
I have a fundamental question to ask. I mean, here we've been talking for 45 minutes, and I still don't understand the topic. Supreme Court. What does the Supreme Court do? Does the Supreme Court decide on the constitutionality of laws, state or federal? Or does the Supreme Court decide whether actions by an individual or groups of individuals or corporations are unconstitutional? I always thought that it was that the Supreme Court decided on the constitutionality of laws, but it seems like they're getting into cases where the law is not being judged; it's the act itself. Am I being coherent here?
I think the problem is that it's you're right that it's confusing.
I'm confused anyway.
Yeah, they change their minds, it appears. Again, I wish John were here. Over time, and as a result, it's not possible to predict in addition, I think cases don't get to the Supreme Court unless the issues are murky. And lower courts can't come up with a coherent decision that can be accepted by all of the conflicting parties. And oh, by the way, those conflicting parties have to have a lot of money in order to get it up that high. So these are influential parties in our society. Even if the person that's that's appealing to the Supreme Court may be penniless, he's got a lot of money behind him to pay for the costs of going that high. So it's somewhere somebody cares. But yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Omar.
So related question that what you are describing, related question is who decides which case to take? Is it the clerks of the court, or is it the Chief Justice who decides, or is the whole bunch of them sit together and say, "Oh, okay, this one"?
I think the latter. There's some things where they can come up with something short of everybody considering it. The shadow docket, I don't totally understand it, but basically one judge can say, no, we're not going to take that. Or one judge can say, yeah, hold off on implementation because I think the court itself is going to take this up. But I'm not 100% sure of that. John, if you're listening, we desperately need you.
It may not work.
Can't shoot me for trying. Well, I guess you can. I don't know. We have 5 minutes left. I issued a what I thought was a hierarchy of rights. Do you guys have a hierarchy of rights?
You mean individual rights or what? Or just rights in general?
If a court has got to decide between two conflicting rights, two parties have conflicting views, both backed up by rights that our society holds as being very important, whether it be freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to not have your house taken arbitrarily. Those are the ones that come to mind off the top of my head, and they're in conflict.
I mean, in the ideal world, in my ideal world, I would say Supreme Court has to undertake an executive function and decide which answer is the best for society in general. It may be not good for either side, but I think the Supreme Court has to take the long view. What is best for society in the long run? Which may be not to take the case at all.
But not taking a case is actually making a decision. Whatever decision that's being appealed, it was a decision by somebody, and if you don't take the case, you're basically saying that decision is.
Well, that's possible, yeah.
And how do you decide what's best for society, particularly if you can't ground it in a fundamental right?
That becomes political. It probably becomes political, unfortunately.
Thank you for letting me know.
Omran, do you have a
I agree with Steve actually on this thing that there should be this long-term good involved, and then of course it also immediately gets into the political piece. It just occurred to me that there was a long time, I forgot which time, the 1900s or something like that. There was a guy from India who was given, he was awarded U.S. citizenship, and then he was the citizenship was revoked, because he was arguing that he was Caucasian. He's Caucasian. So based on that, he said, I should be allowed to come in and become a citizen. He had served in the army, actually. And the Supreme Court said the society has defined a white man, not the way you look. So based on that, that's the end of his citizenship. So you can see where the politics comes in and society at large, how complicated it is. It's good that we are not on the bench. Let them decide it. But I think I agree with Steve that Supreme Court should actually take up the longer good in view before making a decision for the society.
There's a very interesting case being played out now on the world scene, which I think addresses this topic exactly. In the United States, the Biden administration would love to curtail the activist powers of the Supreme Court, where in Israel, Netanyahu is trying to curtail the powers of the Supreme Court, and the Biden administration is criticizing that. So these things are very difficult to when you play out. Am I correctly interpreting what's going on with that particular case?
It's very, very simple. You decide my way, you're great. This is the way the system should be. You decide the other way, we want to change.
Well, I mean, I am detecting a big inconsistency here. I'm not against the Biden administration, but it doesn't seem to be following a pure path here.
Well, I agree with you. What's going on in Israel is very, very bad. And in some respects, it's similar to the United States. Not all, but part of the motivation for curtailing the court's authority is so that Netanyahu cannot be prosecuted. So, and we have something very similar that could be happening in the United States in the very near future.
Yes.
I mean, that's because if the religious leaders join together.
Yeah, well, again, there's a very strong group in the United States who believes that the root of all evil is not going back to the Bible and using the Bible as the basis for deciding disputes. And there's some logic to that. Certainly, that's been done over millennia. But then you have some of these people who believe that are saying that only the people who follow that view specifically can be part of this as full participants in society. Everybody else is at best a guest. I don't think that's appropriate. And I think that the founders, going back to the founders, they were dealing with a whole bunch of groups that didn't agree with each other on fundamental issues. They were burning Quakers in Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania was a Quaker state. They came to a decision that the cooperating was better than a whole bunch of little states running around fighting with each other. And so they went away from the Confederate Union and came to this federalist thing where there was a central government. If that be the case, then maybe in that sense they were right. By the way, you said something. How do you know what the founding fathers believed? Because in the fight over the Constitution, they wrote it all down. The Federalist Papers, the articles, etc., were written trying to influence, in one way or another, how the population would vote.
No, I understand that. What I meant to say was, how do we know what they would interpret about today's life? I mean, what would they say about AK-47s?
They'd say, holy crap, but boy, is that neat.
What
Um,
time? What time? Doesn't it have an end?
We should be done. If we're not done already, we should be done in the next couple of
What
minutes.
time does it end?
Um,